Before we begin, a quick disclaimer. The events of this episode take place somewhere in the middle of the 21st century BCE, but the exact dates are totally uncertain. Like most of the First Intermediate period, we have tiny pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, but different scholars will reconstruct that puzzle in different ways. What follows is my interpretation, based on wider scholarship and my reading of the sources, but by no means is it the only possible version. Just bear that in mind as our story unfolds. Thank you. 4,000 years ago, approximately, a group of Egyptian soldiers marched along a desert road. They were armed with shields, spears, perhaps daggers and bows. They were a skilled group of warriors, known as Mesha-Hui, or assault troops. They were marching through a series of hills, rocky outcroppings that dominated desert valleys and provided impassable barriers to passage. Between these hills, narrow areas allowed pathways or tracks that crisscrossed the desert and connected different parts of the Nile Valley with the oases far to the west. The cliffs of these outcroppings are decorated with inscriptions, pieces of art and writings from countless travelers across history. From the prehistoric period around 3200 BCE, all the way up to the Roman Empire, travelers have crossed these paths and left their mark on the walls. One day, around 4,000 years ago, this group of soldiers, the Mesha-Hui, or assault troops, stopped briefly in the shadow of a cliff. One of them, perhaps their leader, took out a chisel or a piece of sharp rock to leave his own inscription on the sandstone desert walls. The text was simple, a quick reference to the body of troops, the Mesha-Hui, and a symbol below it referencing their commander or their overlord. Notably, this commander was a king. His name was recorded in a cartouche, and it bore the unmistakable symbol, the Sa-Ra, or the Son of Ra. The troops were coming from the south at a community called Waset, or Thebes. Apparently, their leader had declared himself a king. Intef I died somewhere around 2055 BCE. We don't know the exact date, that's just a ballpark. His reign, or at least part of it, might be contemporary with some of the activities and people I'm about to describe in this episode. Unfortunately, his biography and his tomb does not reference those individuals explicitly. He does not name many of his contemporaries. So historians can only provide a rough chronology for his life and how it matches up with other events in southern Egypt. One thing we can say is that sometime after his death, possibly quite quickly, his kingdom, quote-unquote, came under foreign control. Intef I had sons, heirs, who have tombs right next to his in the necropolis of Hefat, or Mawala. Those sons have titles similar to their fathers, but noticeably, they seem to have a lower rank than he did. For example, Intef I's sons have titles like the foremost of the district of Nekin, that is, the leading citizen of the district. But this is a lower rank than Intef I's title of Great Overlord of Nekin. That is a specific administrative rank, one that gave him authority over the whole district. The fact that Intef I's sons, his heirs, do not carry on his Great Overlord title suggests that that power and that position passed to someone else after Intef I's death. Who was it exactly? Well, we can't say for sure because the title Great Overlord of Nekin actually disappears from the record. Intef I is the last known ruler of this district to bear that specific title. That could mean a couple of things. Firstly, perhaps the person who inherited Tifi's title, his status as Great Overlord, is simply undiscovered. We haven't found their tomb or a monument belonging to them. Alternatively, we might interpret it as Tifi's kingdom, or his districts, coming under the rule of another. There might be circumstantial evidence for this. Tifi's tomb at Mawala is large and elaborate, but it's not perfect and it's not intact. The tomb is severely damaged, partly due to natural collapse from earthquakes or subsidence, but it also has signs of intentional damage, scratches and erasures in certain parts of the scenes. It's possible that following his death, somebody violated Tifi's tomb. This might have been grave robbers hoping to plunder the treasures that lay with the Great Overlord. Or it might have been something more political, somebody trying to erase Tifi's memory and deny him posthumous power. Who could have done that? The answer to that might lie in the story that is about to unfold, as one of the groups or states near to Tifi's territory suddenly begins to expand. We'll explore that in this episode. Before he left, Tifi did make provisions for his tomb. He arranged furnishings and goods for his burial, and he made plans for the security of his eternal rest. Tifi's tomb is one of those rare Egyptian monuments that does include something like a curse. He says the following, quote, "As for any great overlord, that is, ruler of the district, who will govern in Hefat, and who would commit a bad or malevolent act towards this burial or towards any part of this tomb, that violator, his arm will be cut off for the god Chemen. His arm will be cut for Chemen at his procession on the east and west bank of the river. And the god Chemen will not accept this violator's offering. Chemen will accept none of his meals, and the violator's son or heir will not inherit from him." End quote. In popular conception, ancient Egyptian tombs and curses go hand in hand. But historically, they're actually incredibly rare. Curses do show up here and there. They are usually connected with offerings or the provisions of a tomb and its burial. Because the ancient Egyptians needed food, drink, and all good things in the afterlife, they tried to warn anyone who would interfere with those supplies and gifts. But when it comes to the tomb itself, it's actually quite rare to have a surviving example of a curse. Tifi is one of the best examples. He warns any of his successors, anyone who takes over the title of Great Overlord, that if they violate his tomb, if they damage it in any way, then they will be physically mutilated. Their arms will be cut in the name of the god Chemen, and that god will not accept any offerings or any prayers, and their political power will evaporate with their death. It's an elaborate and extremely specific warning against any who would damage the tomb. It also has a notable feature. Tifi is specifically warning any great overlord, that is, anyone who has the same title he bore in life. But you would think Tifi would have planned to pass his title on to his son or heirs. The fact that he acknowledged there might be somebody else holding that position suggests that by the time he died, things were becoming a little bit unstable. Perhaps Tifi was not confident that his rule, his lineage, would continue with his heirs. Perhaps he realized that having expanded his own power in life and taken over various districts, somebody else could very well do that in the years to come. And so he includes this warning that is both incredibly specific in the punishments, but also suitably vague in exactly who it targets. Reading between the lines, we get the idea that by the time of his death, Tifi's kingdom was far from secure. In hindsight, Tifi's anxieties seem to be more than justified, as following events will attest. So we bid farewell to Tifi, a man who, for better or worse, exemplifies the difficulties of the early First Intermediate period. His death marks the end of that early phase. Now, we move into the Middle Years, a time when things will become even more convoluted politically and also far more violent. The next part of the story requires a little bit of geographic table setting. We are focusing on a very specific part of the Nile Valley, an area that today is known as the Qena Bend. The Qena Bend is an area where the Nile Valley bends. As it makes its way north towards the Mediterranean Sea, it suddenly veers eastward in a large loop, kind of like a letter C, but back to front. The river starts its bend just north of Hefat or Mawala, where Intef I set up his tomb. It moves northeastward, passing major towns like Armant, Luxor or Thebes, Gebtu or Coptos, and Dendera. And then it starts to make its way westward once more, before it resumes its northward journey around the area of Abydos. The Qena Bend is significant for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it dramatically extends the length of the Nile Valley in this particular area. When the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, this eastward bend massively expands the amount of farmland in the southern regions, and also brings the Nile Valley further out into the eastern hills. That is important. The eastern tip of the Qena Bend happens at a place called Coptos, ancient Gebtu, and it is here, at Coptos, that the ancient Egyptians used to start their journeys when they headed to the Red Sea. There are several paths that make their way through the eastern hills, but the path starting at Coptos is the shortest one. It is known today as the Wadi Hammamat, and it is a famous site in Egyptology. The Wadi Hammamat connects the Qena Bend of the Nile Valley to the coast of the Red Sea, and it is dotted with various mines for copper and gemstones in the eastern hills. The Egyptians used these paths frequently at all eras of their history, and the Wadi Hammamat is one of the most significant roads through that eastern desert. That makes the Qena Bend and the city of Coptos on its eastern edge extremely important from a strategic and economic perspective. Here, access to the Wadi Hammamat and the Red Sea coast was easier than any other point on the Nile Valley. And for the people living in southern Egypt, that made Coptos, or Gebtu, one of the most prominent centers. On the other side of the Nile Valley, to the west, the Qena Bend presents the opposite problem. If you are looking at the Nile Valley, the desert seems to bulge eastward at this exact point. So anyone living along the river here, say at Waset or Luxor, Gebtu or Coptos, or Eunet or Dendera, if they need to access the western desert to travel to the oases or the trading routes that go into Africa, this particular point is not an ideal starting place. Traveling westward from the Qena Bend takes days longer than it would at other locations. But they still want to access those regions, which means that the desert hills in this massive bulge are also incredibly strategic. This is important to understand with the story that is about to unfold, because much of the conflict that begins in this region around 2055 BCE focuses on those desert paths, the routes leading away from the Nile River out towards the east and west. We'll explore this more as the story unfolds, but to set the scene, the Qena Bend, starting just north of Hefat or Mawala and stretching east as it carries on its journey, is a strategic part of the Nile Valley, and soon it would become a battlefield. For this episode, the most significant towns on the Qena Bend are the cities of Waset, Thebes or Luxor, and the city of Gebtu, also known as Coptos. The two towns are located on the eastern edge of the bend. Waset is in the southern portion, and Gebtu is in the northern. Both locations are strategically significant, and the area between these two towns, along the Nile River and in the desert hills to the west, were going to be the flashpoint in the first phase of conflict. Now, to understand that conflict, let's meet the rulers of these particular towns, starting with Waset. Today, the modern visitor to Luxor, Thebes, or Waset mainly sees monuments of the New Kingdom and the Greek and Roman periods. The Temple of Karnak, for instance, is almost entirely a product of those eras. Same with the Temple of Luxor and the memorial structures on the West Bank. To imagine Waset or Luxor around the First Intermediate period, you basically have to delete all of the famous monuments from your mind's eye. Instead, we need to imagine an agricultural zone, dotted with smaller villages and maybe one large settlement around the area of modern Karnak. We could imagine the West Bank having a few tombs and maybe some tiny shrines or temples dedicated to famous locals. Archaeologists working in Luxor have found traces of these early periods, small corners of the villages or settlements, a few tombs and cemeteries dating to the earliest phases, and tiny traces of the rulers whom we are about to meet. To find those meager traces, archaeologists often have to dig below later monuments. So a lot of what we know about early Waset comes from tiny sections discovered between much greater monuments. And yet, those tiny fragments have been remarkably informative, and we know a lot more than you'd expect about the early rulers of Thebes. Let's introduce some of them. Around 2055 BCE, give or take, the ruler of Waset, or Thebes, was a man named Intef, or Iniotef. This translates as, he brings his father, possibly referring to a deity who can be the metaphorical father of the individual. In modern English, we tend to read this name as Intef. You're going to hear that name a lot in the coming episodes. Intef, also known as Intef I, was the great overlord of Waset, the Intef in Waset. He is the first major figure in what would become a new political dynasty. The family seems to come from a sort of rural aristocracy. They show up in the historical records around 2100 BCE or so, as the Old Kingdom slowly faded into irrelevance. We don't know if this family, the Intefs, held any political power during the Old Kingdom, but at the very least we can say that as royal power started to decline, the Intef family started to consolidate power, and before too long they would make their own bid for authority. Around 2055 BCE, give or take, the great overlord of Waset, Intef, or Intef I, made his bid for independent authority. He did this by adopting a title. Monuments and artifacts referencing Intef give him the title Intef I in Shemau. This translates as the Great Overlord of Southern Egypt. The title Great Overlord of the South is kind of a combination of two pre-existing titles. The first is Intef I, or Great Overlord, which applies to a specific district or region of the Nile Valley. Intef I, for example, was a great overlord in his district. But Intef I takes that title and combines it with another one, the title of Overseer of the South. The Southern Overseer, or Emira Shemau, is actually a royal title, one belonging to a servant of the crown. We met one of these overseers of the South in the previous episode, when Intef I had to deal with an inspection by one of those overseers. The historical records relating to the overseers of the South are surprisingly detailed and extensive. We know several of them from the Old Kingdom and First Intermediate period. But Intef I takes that title, Overseer of the South, and combines it with his existing title of Great Overlord. Effectively, he is declaring himself the ruler of the entire southern part of the country. This is an incredibly significant move. In our previous chapters, we saw how Intef I was able to expand his political authority and his rule over several neighboring districts. But no matter how powerful he became, Intef I always worked within the existing royal system. He never tried to claim titles higher or more grandiose than he was legitimately entitled to. He never visibly overstepped what was acceptable. But Intef I goes further than Intef I ever did. Instead of simply expanding his authority over neighboring regions, his claim to be a great overlord, not just of a district, but of all the southern lands, was basically a challenge to the royal authority. In a sense, Intef had declared himself an independent ruler. Shortly after his self-promotion, we begin to find records of Intef as the great overlord of the south. The most significant one is a stela, a stone slab decorated with images and hieroglyphs belonging to one of Intef's servants. This servant was also named Intef. You can also read this name as Intef, so I'm going to call this man Intef to distinguish him from the ruler. Intef was a general, an overseer of troops, or Emira Mesha. Basically, he was in charge of the great overlord's private army, the troops of Waset that would enforce their political will. Intef, the general, is significant because his stela tells an interesting tale of political events during this time. He says the following, quote, I, the general Intef, traveled downriver and upriver on a mission for the hereditary prince and great overlord of the south, Intef, or Intef I. I went to the place where the rulers of northern and southern Egypt were going. Every chief had gathered there, and they rejoiced upon meeting me, because I was excellent of speech. I am one who is outspoken, the commanding of voice on the day of gathering. I am the revered one, Intef. End quote. This little passage may not sound like much, but it seems to record something interesting. The general Intef tells of a gathering, a meeting between the rulers, or Hekau, of northern and southern Egypt. That is, he seems to be describing a convocation, a great meeting of political leaders at a specific location and time. The purpose of this great council is not recorded, and Intef does not tell us who exactly was gathering in this place. But if we read between the lines, there are a couple of interesting things going on here. Presumably, this council was called by the king living in the north, because logically, they would be the only one with the authority to summon everybody to a single place. But significantly, the general Intef does not reference that particular king. He doesn't give their name, and he doesn't even say that it was the king himself who organized this meeting. That tells us something about the political attitude going on here. Even if the general Intef is traveling to the Great Council, he is not willing to publicly acknowledge the authority or even the identity of that northern king. So clearly the general Intef and his master, the great overlord of the south, Intef I, considered themselves to be politically independent. They did not have to answer to the king or acknowledge his identity and rule in any specific way. They might go to the meeting, but they would do so on their own terms. Equally significant, Intef I, the great overlord of Waset and the south, did not travel to this meeting in person. He sent his representative, Intef the general, to go on his behalf. Now, Intef claims to have been a great speaker and one whom everybody was glad to see. Because of his excellent skill and his wonderful speech, when he showed up, everybody was happy. The party don't start till he walks in. We can also make a few guesses about the political situation. On the one hand, Intef I, the overlord of Waset and supposed great overlord of the south, feels secure enough to not attend a meeting between all the rulers or Hekau of the land. He feels so politically important and influential that he can send a representative on his behalf, As if this meeting is beneath his notice, he does not have time to exchange pleasantries. Alternatively, you could read this situation as Intef I testing the waters of his newly claimed position. The fact that Intef sends his general rather than attending the meeting itself might suggest that he did not feel particularly secure, that he was worried if he went in person he might be arrested or executed for his political presumption. In this interpretation, the General Intef did not start the party when he walked in, but he went as a lamb to the slaughter. Clearly nobody executed Intef for representing the great overlord, because he was able to return to Waset in peace, and to commission a monument to his deeds and the occurrence of this event. But you have to wonder if the great overlord Intef sent his representative to avoid even the possibility of trouble. There is a scene in the 1972 film The Godfather where the representatives of great mafia families gather at a hotel in order to discuss recent conflicts and issues. It's a political scene in which the leaders bicker and spar with one another and decide on certain arrangements as to how they're going to govern their territories and deal with political or diplomatic issues. On the surface, this particular scene helps to resolve a major conflict between two of the mafia families. But in the bigger picture, the scene represents the division of power, wealth, and spoils along the eastern coast of the United States of America. It's probably my favorite scene in that film, but I've always thought of it in terms of the Roman republicans, the great bosses like Caesar, Sulla, Pompey, and Crassus. But the story of General Intef traveling downriver to a convocation of the rulers reminds me a lot of this scene. I would have loved to be a scarab on the wall of that particular meeting. What were they talking about? Were the northern lords complaining about Intef's presumption and his self-promotion to the title of Great Overlord of the South? Were representatives of the king trying to pacify the situation or bring greater force to bear on Intef and his representative? What exactly was this meeting about? What was so significant that every provincial ruler had to attend or send a representative? I do like to imagine this as a sort of Godfather moment. So the Lord of Waset, Intef I, had declared himself, effectively, independent from the northern kingdom. He had invented the title Great Overlord of the South, seemingly denying royal authority, which had been represented by the Overseer of the South. But the northerners had something to say about that. Now, we need to meet the lords of Gebtu, or Koptos. This is a city north of Waset, or Thebes, further along the Kenna Bend, and near the eastern limit of that part of the river. Gebtu, or Koptos, is an old town indeed. Archaeological evidence from this settlement and surrounding regions dates all the way back to the prehistoric era, the time before a unified kingdom. During the Old Kingdom, the town of Gebtu, or Koptos, had enjoyed royal patronage, and its local temple, which was dedicated to Min, the god of male fertility, had been an important part of the religious and political landscape. Gebtu had become especially prominent during the late Old Kingdom. As the power of the crown declined, the local rulers of Gebtu continued to enjoy royal patronage and blessings. Historical evidence from Gebtu suggests that the local aristocracy had developed strong connections with the royal household. They had done this through marriages and maneuvering themselves into positions of government authority. As a result, they were well placed to manipulate the crown and ensure they received favorable treatment. This is exemplified in a body of texts known as the Koptos Decrees. The Koptos Decrees are a body of texts dating from the 6th, 7th, and 8th dynasties. They come from the royal household living in the north, and they include rulers like Pepi I, Pepi II, and some of the lesser-known rulers of the late Old Kingdom, kings like Nefer-Ka-Hor and Nefer-Ka-Ra. The decrees, broadly, give political, religious, and economic benefits to the aristocrats of Gebtu. There's quite a few, so I won't read all of them, but just as an example, a decree from the king Nefer-Ka-Hor, who probably lived around 2150 BCE, give or take, goes as follows, quote, "A king's decree to the god's father, the beloved one of the god, the hereditary noble, the overseer of the pyramid town, the vizier and overseer of document scribes of the king, the overseer of priests named Shemai. My majesty has commanded that we will raise for you 12 inspectors or priests for the Ka chapel of your funerary estate. They will do priestly duties for you, and they will carry out the monthly festivals for you." End quote. There are a lot of these decrees. In fact, in one case, we have 8 of them from a single king, all prepared on the same day. The ruler Nefer-Ka-Hor seems to have issued a whole suite of decrees for the aristocrats of Gebtu. Several of the decrees are dated to the 2nd month of the Période season, day 20, in the presence of the king himself, Nefer-Ka-Hor. Apparently, that ruler issued a whole suite of messages on different subjects in the same period of time, and each message went out as an individual decree. This spate of executive orders are just a small sample of the decrees that come from Gebtu or Koptos. There's quite a few of them, but if you're interested to read them, they are all fully published in the book Texts from the Pyramid Age by the historian Nigel Strudwick. I recommend that book. Anyway, by 2055 BCE, approximately, the lords of Gebtu don't seem to enjoy the same favor or closeness with the royal household. There could be a couple of reasons for that. For one thing, the royal house itself has changed since the Old Kingdom. It is no longer the lineage of Pepi and Nefer-Ka-Hor. Instead, the House of Keti is the one in charge of the north. Maybe the House of Keti did not have the same connections or appreciation for the aristocrats of Gebtu, or they didn't have the political or economic influence to make these sort of decrees so far to the south. Either way, by 2055, Gebtu and its rulers are a bit more distant from the royal authority. They're not enjoying the same privileges as they had before. Nevertheless, the lords of Gebtu were still loyal followers of the king, part of the royal administration and representatives of the House of Keti in the north. We know 2 of these lords. Allow me to introduce a man called User. User, which either means powerful or possibly a reference to Osiris, is one of the overlords of Gebtu or Koptos during this period. He is a royal official in the classic sense. User has the titles God's Father or Itnecher, which can either be a priestly title related to a temple and a god, or possibly a reference to family connections with the king himself in the north. That family connection might be more likely, because User also calls himself the king's eldest son of his body, or Sa Nesut Semer en Chetef. This title is a little bit complicated. It's not always literal, meaning that the owner is a family member of the royal household. People can be called the king's eldest son of their body, even if they have no demonstrable connection with the royal lineage. So it seems to be an honorific in at least some situations. User might be a cousin, nephew, or even a son of one of the rulers in the north, but we can't say that with any certainty, and we don't have any direct proof of the connection. But clearly, he was well connected to the king's administration, a loyal member of the regime, and a representative of their power. User also had the title Overseer of Southern Egypt, Emira Shemau. This was the classic and legitimate title of the royal representative in the south. The title that Intef I, upriver in Waset, had usurped and expanded into Great Overlord of the South. So, from a political or administrative sense, User was in direct competition with Intef. Both of them claimed to be the supreme royal authority in the southern part of the country, and that would bring them into conflict before too long. User is an interesting figure. We only have a couple of artifacts or monuments that reference his life and reign, but these pieces are quite informative. Archaeologists discovered a stela of User in a town called Kozam. Kozam is a town south of Gebtu, approximately halfway between Gebtu and Waset, or Thebes. So it's close to the territory of Intef I and the upstart leaders of that particular region. Kozam, which the Egyptians called Yushenshen, is only 16 kilometers away from Waset, if you're flying direct. The fact that User, the overlord of Gebtu and the overseer of southern Egypt, seems to have left monuments at this particular site might suggest that he and the royal administration were trying to secure the border against the upstart Intef. They might have been moving military force into this region in order to guard against any attack, or, alternatively, to intimidate Waset and its leaders. The move to Kozam, or Yushenshen, might also be a larger strategic move, an attempt to gain control over the desert roads that go east and west from this part of the Nile. We'll come back to those roads in just a few moments. But long story short, the fact that User, the significant representative of the king, shows up specifically at Kozam suggests, tentatively, they were trying to push back against Waset and its great overlord Intef. User died sometime before 2055 BCE. How much earlier? We don't know. But one of his successors is quite well recorded, and he lived to experience the conflict that now broke out with Waset. User's heir was a man named Tjauti, and like User, he wielded the title Overseer of Southern Egypt, or Emira Shemau. Tjauti was also well connected with the royal government and its system. He used the title God's Father, the Beloved of the God, or It Netcher, Meri Netcher. Again, possibly referencing a blood or family connection with the royal lineage, or at least close political and social ties with them. Tjauti also had a title that is quite significant in the local geographic and strategic sense. Officially, Tjauti was called the confidant, or one who fills the heart of the king, in the door of the desert of southern Egypt. In Egyptian, this sounds something like Mech'ib en Nesut em Ra'aya Chasset Shemau. It's a title related to those desert roads, places like the Wadi Hammamat or the routes leading to the western oases. The desert roads are incredibly important both in the local economy, connecting to trade routes, but also for military and political reasons. Whoever controls the desert routes has extra options for traveling across the country. Most of the time, we think of Egyptians traveling on the Nile River, going south to north or north to south on that great wide highway. However, from a military or strategic perspective, the Nile is not exactly ideal territory for movements and transport. You can think of the Nile as a great road running through the country, but it is limited in terms of its width, and any ruler who can gather together a couple dozen boats might conceivably block the Nile at any point along its route. In other words, the Nile is the highway of Egypt, but in terms of travel and transport, it is incredibly vulnerable to local machinations. With that in mind, the roads that cross the desert are a vital path for any local ruler. If ever there was trouble on the Nile River, it was important to access those roads in order to circumvent difficulties, or to access important regions and trade routes. This is especially true at the Kenna Bend, that great eastward extension of the Nile River. Because the Nile suddenly deviates in this great wide bend, it leaves a large stretch of desert hills in the intervening space. Those hills officially came under the authority of the royal official at Gebtu, the confidant, or one who fills the heart of the king in the door of the desert of southern Egypt. This title is wielded by Tjauti, and also by his predecessor, User. They both claim authority over these desert paths, and these roads were an important part of their business and duties. Soon, these roads would be a source of conflict. Intef's claim to be the great overlord of the south was not an idle boast. From a city just downriver, about 50 kilometers north of Waset, as the bird flies, there is a city called Iyunet. Iyunet is famous as the modern town of Dendera, the cult center of the great goddess Hathor, Lady of Turquoise, Mistress of the Sky, Protector of Horus, and a being for whom one can truly say the party does not start until she walks in. Dendera, or Iyunet, is the sacred city of Hathor. During the First Intermediate period, the city itself was governed by an overseer of the priests. This is a common title for major religious centers in southern Egypt. They're not quite governors and not quite mayors, but they seem to fulfill those functions in addition to commanding the priests and organizing the offerings. These religious administrators seem to be in control of towns like Dendera, and around 2055 BCE, we have a record of one of these overseers giving obedience to the great lord of Waset. A fragmentary inscription excavated at Dendera records part of a text. It mentions a commission or command given to the local overseer, and it even references the priests of the great goddess Hathor. This commission, apparently, came from the Tep Aya en Shemau, Inni Yotef. That is, it came from Intef, the great overlord of the south. What is interesting about this inscription is that Dendera, or Iyunet, is north of the cities of Gebtu and Ushenshen, the major bastions of royal authority in southern Egypt at the time. So apparently, the lord of Waset, Intef, had somehow conquered Dendera without taking over the intervening regions of Gebtu and Ushenshen. If we're thinking about this in terms of military or political strategy, it seems as though Intef and the people of Waset were attempting to encircle Gebtu and Ushenshen. They already controlled the river to the south of Gebtu. Now, by taking over Dendera, they were cutting off the river to the north. In recent military history, you might call this kind of maneuver a Kesselschlacht, a cauldron battle, attempting to encircle the enemy and cut them off from assistance. Unfortunately, the inscription does not give us any information as to whether this was an outright military conquest, or whether Intef had made a deal with the leaders of Dendera. Perhaps he had brought them in diplomatically, no bloodshed required. But either way, looking at a map of the Nile Valley, it seems fairly clear that the great overlord Intef and his followers were attempting to encircle Gebtu. How did they do that? Dendera is north of Waset or Luxor, so it's downriver along the Nile Valley. Surely Intef wasn't just hopping onto a boat and sailing down to Dendera, right past the cities of Ushenshen and Gebtu, where his rivals like User and Tjauti were in command. The Nile might be the great highway of Egypt, but it's not an ocean. The Nile is narrow enough that a decent fleet of boats can easily block any passage. So naturally, we may ask, how did Intef or his followers even get to Dendera? Well, this is why I spent a few minutes talking about geography. The Kenna Bend, on which Waset, Gebtu, and Dendera are all located, is the great eastward extension of the Nile Valley. But between the two ends of that bend, there is the great mass of the Western Desert, a series of mountains, hills, and valleys that fill the gap of the Nile bend itself. That desert is neither impassable nor totally hostile, and from the earliest centuries, ancient Egyptians would travel along the desert roads in small or large expeditions. The lords of Waset probably used these roads to isolate Gebtu and cut it off from reinforcements. Remarkably, that's not just an educated guess. We actually have records testifying to this. Around 2055 BCE, Tjauti, the overseer of southern Egypt and the confidant of the king in the door of the southern desert, left his base at Gebtu or Koptos and headed west. He and his followers crossed the Nile River, and they began to march into the desert hills which fill the Kenna Bend. They headed south and west, across rocky outcroppings and the wadis or valleys formed by ancient rains and riverbeds. They skirted summits, descended crevices, and made their way carefully through these hills and valleys. At a certain point, the troop stopped in the shadow of an overhanging cliff. This outcropping, or Gebel, provided a good place to stop, and it seems to have been relatively private and disused. Tjauti and his soldiers were not the first people to visit this outcropping. Travelers and groups had come here over the past 1,000 years. But, based on the surviving inscriptions, Tjauti might have been the first visitor for at least a few generations, perhaps as much as a century. The most recent inscription before Tjauti dates to the 6th dynasty, around 2200 BCE. Noting the significance of the event, Tjauti took up a stone or a chisel and carved hieroglyphs onto the walls of the outcropping. His words went as follows, quote, "The god's father, beloved of the god, the hereditary noble, the overseer of southern Egypt, Tjauti, says the following. I have made this inscription for crossing this mountain, which the ruler of another district had closed. I fought with his district, and I flew." The text breaks off here. Wind and rain have eroded the end, and we do not know where Tjauti flew. But the inscription is significant. Tjauti records an official royal expedition into the hills of the Kenna Bend. Apparently, he came out here to forge a new path through the desert mountains. He did this because the lord of another district, an unnamed ruler of a neighboring region, had closed the mountain pathways to any outsiders. In order to find a new route through the desert, Tjauti and his followers had forged their own path. The mountain on which this inscription is carved is approximately 25 kilometers southwest of Gebtu or Koptos. It seems to be an official inscription. The hieroglyphs are deeply carved into the rock, and the carving itself is skilled. These are not random scratches made with a stone by somebody who is barely literate. Perhaps Tjauti himself made, or at least oversaw, the carving of these hieroglyphs, a stamp of his authority as a representative of the crown. Tjauti made this endeavor in response to another ruler's aggression. He does not specifically name that other ruler, but in the context, it is a fairly good guess that it was the lord of Waset, or Thebes, who had closed the desert routes. Geographically, the two closest centers to this mountain are Gebtu, or Koptos, and Waset, or Thebes. These are the two cities and rulers which would most benefit from access to these roads. So while Tjauti does not specifically name him, we can guess that he was making a move against the overlord of Waset, Intef I. That seems to be confirmed by the next phase of events. Tjauti and his soldiers passed through the region and left their official inscription to mark their opening of a new desert road. But eventually they passed on and left this area, either to conduct military operations against the Thebans just to the south, or returning home to Gebtu, flush with victory and proud of their achievement. But that achievement did not last long. Tjauti's inscription decorates the wall of this lonely desert mountain. But a few meters away, there is another text. Just to the north of Tjauti's official, well-carved hieroglyphs, there is a scratching on the rock surface. This one is far less elegant and refined. It seems to have been done with a stone, likely a piece of flint, and the figures and hieroglyphs are rough at best. Whoever did the carving was either in a terrible hurry or was not particularly skilled in the art of writing and carving. But what they lacked in literacy, they more than made up for in aggression. Just to the north of Tjauti's declaration how he had opened a new road, we find a very short set of hieroglyphs that record the, quote, Mesha Hui Sa Ra Inni Yitef. In English, that translates as the striking troops of the son of Ra, Intef. Apparently, Intef I sent a body of soldiers along this desert road in order to claim it for the rulers of Waset. These soldiers may have been professional. They are specifically described as Mesha Hui, the striking or assault troops. That is different from your standard Mesha, which is either a laborer or a part-time warrior. A Mesha Hui, or striking troop, suggests a degree of skill, training, and perhaps professionalization. These troops, apparently, were part of Intef's private army. The hieroglyph inscriptions on this desert outcropping were officially discovered by an archaeological survey called the Theban Desert Road Survey. This operates out of Yale University in the United States. And in the late 1990s, the surveyors working for this project discovered the inscriptions on this particular mountain. The inscription of Tjauti is not the earliest text carved on the rocky walls. There are texts from the Old Kingdom and the Predynastic period as well. But Tjauti's text is so distinctive and so detailed compared to the others that the scholars took to calling this particular mountain the Gebel Tjauti. So Tjauti's claim to have opened a new road has now entered the modern lexicon. His claim of ownership over this particular hill has been revived after 4,000 years. Hopefully that is some consolation to the fact that shortly after his visit, Tjauti's road was seized by the troops and ruler of Waset. It's a small consolation, but it's better than nothing. The inscriptions on this desert hill are not terribly detailed compared to others from the same period, but they provide just enough information to reconstruct a sequence of events. Apparently, the overlord of Waset, that is, Intef I, had closed the desert roads near to his region. Waset is in a good position to access many of those roads, so strategically, it was in his best interests to send police or guards out into the desert hills to watch for enemy incursions or raids, and perhaps to protect or oversee any trading caravans passing through the region. In response, Tjauti, the lord of Gebtu, came forth with his own troops in order to chart a new road through the desert hills and valleys. He made, or found this road, at the site now called the Gebel Tjauti. According to his own words, he forged this path in direct response to the aggression of other lords, and Tjauti claimed to have fought with the troops of that district. Unfortunately, Tjauti's efforts did not work, and soon after, Intef, the great overlord of the south, sent his own assault troops to seize this road, and they left their mark. Then again, we shouldn't really call Intef the great overlord of the south. Sharp-eared listeners might have noticed that the rock inscription, which records the presence of his troops, does not give Intef that title. It calls him something quite different. The inscription of the Mesha Hui, or striking troops, includes below it the name of Intef, but this name is enclosed within a cartouche, and it includes two more hieroglyphs, a duck and a sun disk, the ancient phrase Sa Ra, or the son of Ra. This, quite simply, is a royal title. It seems that by the time this inscription was made, Intef I had moved on from his great overlord aspirations, and he had gone for something much higher. He had declared himself a king. Intef is the first overlord of Waset who absolutely, definitively takes on a royal identity. His name is enclosed within a cartouche, and it includes the title Sa-Ra, or Son of Ra, a classic epithet of the Egyptian kings dating all the way back to the 4th dynasty, the age of the Giza pyramids. Additionally, later monuments credit Intef with a Horus name, a man who claims to be the living incarnation or representative of the falcon deity of kingship, Horus himself. Intef's kingly name was Seheru Tawi, which translates as the one who has made the two lands content. A slightly aspirational name in the circumstances. Intef I certainly did not rule both of the two lands. He ruled much of the south, but he could not legitimately claim to be overlord of northern and southern Egypt. So perhaps this name was a claim for the future, a goal to be achieved by the newly declared king, or at least by his descendants. That being said, the name Seheru Tawi doesn't appear on any contemporary monuments of this individual. It's possible he used it during his lifetime, but the name Seheru Tawi might have been given to him by later generations. We'll come back to that story at the appropriate moment, but even if Intef I did not call himself Seheru Tawi during his lifetime, the fact that his descendants gave him this Horus identity suggests that whatever he was doing was considered to be legitimate royal activity. So, sometime around 2055 BCE, Intef I, the Lord of Waset and Great Overlord of the South, took the step that Intef I never could. He went beyond the simple titles of a leader, administrator, and governor, and he declared himself a king. And having claimed that name and title, Intef was willing to use force to send out soldiers to stamp that mark on the regions surrounding Waset. Essentially, around 2055 BCE, the lords of this city had declared independence. The military maneuvers along the desert roads west of the Kenna Bend testify to the early expansion of the Lord of Waset. Chronologically, the rock inscriptions by Tjauti and the striking troops of the son of Ra Intef must have happened after the city of Dendera had been conquered or allied with the Lord of Waset. We can infer that because of the title. In the inscription that shows Dendera allying with Waset, the Lord Intef is referenced as the Great Overlord of the South, but the rock inscriptions in the desert call him the son of Ra Intef. Presumably, once he had made that claim to kingship, that would be the primary title by which anyone would refer to Intef. So unless the Lord of Dendera was being insulting to his ally or master, we can guess a rough chronology of these events. Sometime around 2055, the Lord of Waset, Intef, declares himself to be Great Overlord of the South, in open defiance, even rebellion, against the Northern Kingdom, whose representative, the Overseer of the South, was residing at the cities of Gebtu and Ushenshen, just downriver from Waset. Those overseers, first User and then Tjauti, leave hints of conflict with the Lord of Waset. Sometime after this declaration, Intef was able to subjugate or make an alliance with the overseer of priests in the city of Eunet or Dendera, the cult center of the goddess Hathor, so important to the concept of kingship, now fell in with Intef the Lord of Waset. We get a sense that the self-proclaimed Great Overlord of the South was isolating the nearby cities of Gebtu and Ushenshen. Perhaps he was diplomatically or militarily encircling them, isolating them from any reinforcement and assistance, and perhaps forcing some kind of peaceful negotiation or military submission. The submission might be more likely, because shortly after the fall of Dendera, we get a record from the overseer Tjauti. Leaving his base at Gebtu, or Koptos, Tjauti and his followers make a path into the western desert. They do this in response to Intef's actions. Tjauti went forth to seize the initiative. Unfortunately, Tjauti's efforts came to nothing. First, the striking troops, or Meshahui, who followed Intef, came out to this road that Tjauti had opened or discovered, and they left their own mark near to his, stamping their ownership over the region. So it seems that first at Dendera and then in the western desert, the lords of Gebtu and Yushenshen, the loyalist followers of the northern king, found themselves increasingly isolated. Finally, the lord of Waset made his move against his neighboring loyalist rivals. Sometime around 2055 BCE, give or take, the soldiers of Waset appear to have raided and perhaps defeated the lords of Gebtu. Last episode, I made reference to a period of food shortages or famine that seemed to have struck southern Egypt and brought great misery to its people. The records of this famine are numerous and extensive, and they include those of a man who lived near the town of Gebtu. Around 2055 BCE, approximately, a royal official named Hen-Mes, living at the town of Nakada, left the following record of his work and deeds. Hen-Mes said the following, quote, "The overseer of priests, Jephi, sent me to the town of Yushenshen. I found it ruined. I refounded the town, and I brought back its cattle. I made an account of absolutely everything." End quote. Hen-Mes went upriver to the town of Yushenshen, which is modern Kozam. This is the town where the overseer of the south, User, the predecessor of Tjauti, had set up his base in order to guard the border and watch over the city of Waset. The inscription of Hen-Mes is a little bit hard to date, but it seems to record the aftermath of a raid or devastation of Yushenshen. Hen-Mes describes how the town was in a state of ruin. He doesn't blame anyone specifically for this, but within the context of what is happening politically, it's entirely possible that this ruination is the result of an attack or a raid by the troops of Waset following their newly declared king. If that is accurate, then the inscription of Hen-Mes might be our only surviving evidence for the campaign led by Intef I to defeat his northern rivals and bring the towns of Gebtu and Yushenshen into his domain. It's not hard to imagine how this could have happened. Having taken over, or at least allied, with the city of Eunet, Dendera to the north, and then seized control of the desert roads which cross the Kenna Bend to the west, Intef and his followers had effectively isolated Gebtu and Yushenshen from any outside assistance. The local lords, like Tjauti, would have had no choice but to retreat, heading back to northern territories, to submit, accepting the rule of the self-declared king, or perhaps to fight. It's a decent guess that they chose the latter. Tjauti himself had made reference to fighting the neighboring district when he made his incursion into the desert. And perhaps most notably, Tjauti himself is the last recorded lord of Gebtu or Koptos. Like Intef I to the south, with his disappearance, we come to the end of that recorded title. Putting all of that together, it seems very likely that the great overlord of Waset, the self-declared king Intef, the son of Ra, finally made his move against his local rivals. His troops marched or sailed downriver, first striking the town of Yushenshen, modern Kozam, and perhaps entirely destroying and depopulating it. The locals might have fled or been taken into captivity or submission. The soldiers may have retreated or surrendered and joined the victorious troops of Waset in the conquest of this territory. Whatever happened exactly, there are now enough pieces of historical information to start painting a picture of early Theban expansion. The lord of Waset, Intef, made his declaration of independence. He then named himself as king, and then he started to conquer his rivals. In no uncertain terms, Intef had declared independence and started a civil war. Before I go, let me give a shout out to the priests, my top tier supporters on patreon.com. These fine folks enable me to put food on my table, for which I am eternally grateful. My thanks must go to Andy and Chelsea, Kyla, Terry, Eric, Yola, Mycost, Linda, TJ, Ashley, Nidin, Veronica, James, and Arthur. Folks, you are all too generous. May your communities continue to thrive and grow. May you build walls of the strongest mud brick that overcome all obstacles and endure for millennia. May your households never suffer shortage.